They said sanity was the toll for entry. They said respect required quiet hands and polite sentences. They said your calm must be permanent, and your voice must seep through filters they designed to keep you soft. You broke that porcelain expectation with a grin that sharpened the room. You went full crazy in the way only someone who has studied every exit can. Not a tantrum, not a collapse. A choreography of refusal that felt like thunder walking on tiptoe. You stopped asking how a normal person would handle betrayal and started asking how a free person should. Your laugh turned into a metronome for disruption. Your choices looked like accidents from a distance and like a blueprint when seen from above. The ones who fed on your restraint had grown fat on your compliance. You fed them your unpredictability instead. They peered at you over the railing of their little balcony of certainty and watched you rip the script out of the lighting rig. You put on a performance that had no stage directions. And in the new darkness you carved, their eyes adjusted to a truth they always feared. Control cannot survive someone who no longer needs the permission slip of being reasonable. Crazy is a word polite losers use when precision no longer bows to their rhythm. You gave them a lesson in unlicensed mathematics. Subtract anxiety, multiply boundaries, divide by performance, add audacity until the sum refuses to fit inside their spreadsheets. You stopped trimming your sentences to please fragile ears. You stopped explaining your instincts to people who have never argued with their own shadows. There is a kind of madness that is really just focus wearing war paint. It remembers promises your bones made when no one was listening. It keeps receipts without needing revenge. Your version did not foam, it distilled. You did not break windows. You opened one and let the oxygen starve their little bonfire of gossip. They had built a reputation maze and told you the cheese was freedom. You climbed the wall and walked across the tops like a rooftop thief of narrative. Suddenly the maze looked quaint. Suddenly their rules looked like a children's puzzle printed on soggy cardboard. Your grin widened because you could finally hear the truth under the noise. They never wanted order. They wanted you orderly. You became a contradiction they could not open with reputation keys. You laughed at the wrong time. You nodded at the wrong right time. You praised the silence that followed their grand declarations, while you counted the tremors in their confidence. They said you had gone too far, too fast, too bold, which is what cowards say when momentum stops kissing their feet. You did not raise your volume. You widened your orbit. The city could feel it even if it did not know what to name. Elevators slowed when you stepped in. Meetings rerouted their weather when you breathed. People with swords made of email grew cautious when your posture refused to apologize. You took nothing from them directly. You simply reclaimed your center like a thief stealing back his own watch and leaving a flower where the chain used to hang. They called that flower chaos. You called it evidence that your hands had remembered themselves. Crazy made you unbookable for their theater. They wanted a neat antagonist who snarled on cue. You arrived with velvet stillness and a monologue aimed at the ceiling where the wires hide. You exposed the hinges they paint every quarter. You asked questions that did not end with punctuation. You spoke in lengths that bent their clocks. And while they fumbled for data to discredit your tone, the room chose gravity over gossip. It watched you shrug off the last outfit stitched from their opinions and felt the temperature turn. The ones who had sold you calm like a prescription were suddenly peddling urgency. Urgency could not reach you. Your nervous system had retired from their payroll. There is nothing scarier to managers of fear than someone whose breath moves like a tide chart instead of a fire alarm. You surfed their panic with a smile that said, you knew where the shore lived. You broke the sacred vase of reputation management and poured water on the roots instead. That water looked like madness to those who decorate rot. You sent messages that did not beg. You answered questions with pauses that made the questioner hear their own echo. You shifted rooms without scraping the floor. You asked for nothing and received everything that could not be withheld. They tried to punish you by telling a different story to anyone who would lend them a tired ear. The story wilted in the mouths that repeated it. Lies require the listener to be a garden that never learned sunlight. You seeded the opposite. Your work sprouted in places that do not clap. Your mornings got heavy with fruit. The ones who hoped to starve you began to ration their own names, because the market was tired of cheap thunder. You made a ritual out of refusal. Refusal to dilute your sentences. Refusal to argue with people who only speak to win. Refusal to occupy the seat assigned to you by myths about humility that smell like dust. This ritual was not loud. You lit a candle and turned toward tasks that survive applause. The candle was your calendar. The flame measured your patience. You wrote plans that looked like lullabies and woke cities from them. Your enemies preferred nightmares they authored. They could not compete with dawn. They could not sell their panic to a person who hates discounts. You priced your time at the rate of truth. Crazy is expensive that way. Crazy demands interest on every moment, previously wasted on explaining your worth to accountants of spirit. They built a tower of conflict, hoping to lure you up the staircase and lock the door on a higher floor. You smiled at the stairs. Then you rented the crane. You lifted your process over the parapet and laid it gently on a different block of sky. Their tower suddenly looked like a museum of older mistakes. They waved from windows and told each other you were misplaced. Your results answered like a choir. Placement had followed you. Not because of luck. Because inevitability arrives to those who rebel with discipline. You made your calendar the assassin. It killed their rumors with steady mornings. It shot holes in their coordinated insults with outcomes that would not stop arriving. They changed tactics and tried to seduce you with historic opportunities, wrapped in barbed compliments. You sent them an invoice for the time it took to read the offer. They call that arrogance. Audacity calls it billing. You refused to harm yourself to appear harmless. You refused to soften truth into a confection they could eat without changing. You served it plated in steel. They chipped their teeth and called the chef cruel. You recommended a new diet. They preferred frosting. Crazy is digestion that refuses to pretend sugar's protein. You fed your body words that build tendons. You fed your schedule promises that crunch. Eventually, even the mirrors had no choice but to stop flattering your ghosts. That is when your face returned to you wearing weather that other people cannot steal. You walked into rooms like a climate moving its own clouds. And the ones who measured their days by manipulating umbrellas finally learned what it means to get wet. They gathered a committee to study your refusal. Committees adore explanations because explanations make rebellion sound manageable. You gave them mystery instead. Not coy mystery. Mineral mystery. The kind that sits inside a mountain and does not apologize for being unminnable. They hired analysts to interpret your smile. They hired poets to change your name. They hired clowns to distract the audience while they reset the stage. They forgot the audience had met sunlight. Sunlight once introduced does not go back into the pocket. You did not have to fight the committee. You let them publish their findings. The report read like a love letter to the cage you already dismantled. People read it and felt insulted by its instructions for smallness. Then they asked you about your calendar. There is no committee that survives the moment a crowd learns to count their own hours. You turn mistakes into a compass. The old world teaches shame as the tax for learning. You refused that currency. You paid inattention. You turned your back on perfection and married revision. Revision is the real madness they fear, because revision never ends. It outlives their gossip cycles. It survives their boredom. It renders their sabotage too slow to matter. When a person commits to revision, time stops working for cowards. You revised your boundaries until they fit like armor made of oxygen. You revised your craft until excellence became the only quiet left in the room. You revised your circle until loyalty sounded like a language, not a slogan. The ones who wanted you to crack under the pressure of their choreography watched you grow pressure-proof. Then they tried to imitate your blueprint without sacrificing their addictions. Their replicas melted at sunrise. You blessed the part of you they labeled monstrous, not to indulge it, to educate it. You put the beast in a tailored suit made of patience. You taught it table manners and then built your own table. The beast can recite poetry now. It does not roar, it hums. It hums while you work. It hums while you rest. It hums while cheap provocations knock politely on the door and leave when no one answers. They still whisper that you went full crazy. Let them. You know what you did? You stopped negotiating your breath. You stopped asking strangers to baptize your becoming. You stopped shrinking your edges to fit into their velvet box of tame excellence. You chose a sharper goodness. A goodness that slices through falsehoods. A goodness that bleeds only myths. They deserve that version of you. The version that refuses to perform sanity for people who profit from your sedation. The version that walks out of every room where truth must be translated into flattery. The version that loves so hard it terrifies anyone who has never learned love without leverage. Keep walking. Let their labels chase your dust. The road ahead favors those who scare the right people. They had spent years building their system. Brick by brick, rule by rule, they wrapped the world in invisible strings and called it order. They relied on obedience to keep it standing, not truth. Every lever, every locked door, every whispered threat only worked because people agreed to pretend those levers mattered. You saw it for what it was, a stage set held together with tape and habit. The moment you acted without permission, their masterpiece began to tremble. Not because your move was loud, but because it was free. Freedom is louder than any shout. The whole structure had been designed to keep you asking for approval. And when you stopped, the walls bent inward. They weren't built to handle someone who didn't play their part. They were used to people looking for the green light before moving. They were used to hesitation. That pause before action was where they fed. It was the gap they used to remind you of the rules, to make you second guess, to keep you inside the lines they drew. But you moved without that pause. You didn't ask. You didn't announce. You didn't even wait for them to notice. You acted like their rules were suggestions scribbled in pencil. And that shattered something they had worked hard to protect. The illusion that they were in control. They realized too late that control was never real. It was borrowed from your compliance. The beauty of your move was in its simplicity. You didn't need to break every rule at once. You only needed to show that one could be broken without consequence. That single act was enough to send a ripple through the whole system. If one rule could fall, all of them could. That's the kind of fear they can't patch up with speeches or punishments. They knew the others were watching. They knew eyes had seen you do it, and those eyes would never see them the same way again. That's the danger of an unapproved act. It's contagious. You didn't argue about the rules. You didn't try to convince them they were wrong. You simply acted as though their authority was irrelevant to your choice. And that is what destroyed them. They could have handled a fight. They could have handled defiance if it came wrapped in anger, because they know how to fight anger. But they didn't know how to fight someone who had already walked out of their mental prison. When you don't recognize their power, their weapons turn into toys. Their threats sound like bad jokes. The moment you moved without permission, you took away the oxygen their system needed to breathe. Every command they gave after that moment felt smaller. Every warning felt weaker. Even their allies started to doubt. People noticed the cracks they had ignored before. They noticed how much of the structure was based on assumption, not strength. That's the thing about a tower built on obedience. It doesn't need to be burned down. It only needs one person to walk through the door they said was locked. Your act exposed them. Not because it was grand, but because it was real. It wasn't a performance. You weren't trying to send a message. You simply refused to wait. And in that refusal, you revealed something dangerous. People started asking themselves why they were waiting. They started wondering who had the right to say yes or no to their steps. Questions like that are poison to any system built on submission. They spread fast, and no matter how much they try to silence them, those questions keep growing. They tried to recover. They called meetings. They wrote new policies. They whispered in the right ears to frame you as reckless. But the damage was already done. They could no longer hide the truth. Your actions showed the whole thing was fragile. That's what they fear most. Not someone breaking in from the outside, but someone already inside realizing the locks don't work. And once you've shown that, no one can unsee it. Your move was more than defiance. It was proof. Proof that they had no real hold over you. Proof that their so Called authority was a shadow you could step out of at will. You didn't just make a choice, you shifted the weight of the whole room. Their system wasn't made to survive that shift. The floorboards creaked. The beams groaned. People began to notice the dust falling from the ceiling. They thought strength was in the rules. They thought the rules were unshakable. But your move proved strength lives in the person willing to act without needing the rules at all. That's why their system cracked. Not because you fought it head on, but because you ignored it entirely. You didn't break their game. You made it irrelevant. And nothing collapses faster than a game no one wants to play.